Hi everyone. Welcome to the third instance of our emerging research in comparative literature series. Our first speaker was Thomas Lahusen, and we had John Paul Rico speak last semester. And we're really happy to have someone outside the comparative literature department speak to inaugurate a sort of discussion between Complit and other departments through this series. So I'm Fan Wu, and Jessica will now introduce Professor Kate Holland.
Okay, hi everyone. So Kate Holland is Associate Professor of Russian Literature in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures here at the University of Toronto. She's also the author of the novel In the Age of Disintegration, Dostoevsky and Genre in the 1870s, which was published by Northwestern University Press in 2013, and articles on Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Herzen, Saltykov, Shchedrin, Sand, Zola, and Veselovsky. She's currently coordinating a series of events in North America to mark the 150th anniversary of the first publication of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, and this project has recently won a Shirk Connections grant. She's a founder member of the Working Group on Historical Poetics and recently contributed to Persistent Forms, Explorations in Historical Poetics, edited by Ilya Kliger and Boris Maslov, and that's published by Fordham University Press. She's also an associate faculty member in the Center for Comparative Literature, and she teaches Dostoevsky and the Theory of the Novel course. So yeah, if you're interested by today's talk, you should sign up. Great, thanks Kate.
So today I'm going to start by talking a little bit about historical poetics and Alexander Veselovsky, the founder of this movement, and then I'm going to move into a discussion of some parallels between Veselovsky's and Bakhtin's theory of the novel and studies on the novel. Alexander Veselovsky, whose dates are 1836 to 1906, was a Russian philologist and literary theorist who laid the foundations for the comparative study of literature in the 20th century. As Boris Maslov points out in his introduction to the translation of Veselovsky's Envisioning World Literature in 1863, which is published in the PMLA's Criticism in Translation section in 2013, Veselovsky is widely regarded as the foundational figure of Russian literary criticism, and, quote, his method in its rudimentary form constitutes a common denominator of Shklovsky's, Bakhtin's, and Prop's divergent approaches. As the founder of the method he named Historical Poetics, Veselovsky is the focal point of the recently published volume Persistent Forms, Explorations in Historical Poetics, edited by Ilya Kliger and Boris Maslov, as well as the Historical Poetics Working Group, of which I'm a member. So I'm just going to pass around this volume so you can take a look. Historical Poetics examines literary forms, genres, motifs and devices within deep time, or the Longue-Durée, to use the terminology of the Annales School of Historians. The Longue-Durée refers to what we might call the time of civilizations, or to the deep structural developments underlying literary evolution, and the long-term social and historical changes that engender those developments. Historical poetics has its roots in the comparative study of folklore and of the epic, and Veselovsky began his career as a follower of the Russian wing of the so-called mythological school of comparative folklore. Yet even in its early form, Veselovsky's method had nothing to do with the fanciful reconstructions of the culture and beliefs of a long-lost Aryan race, which characterized that school of comparative mythology. Instead, he was concerned with the transmission and diffusion of narrative forms across Europe and Asia as a result of large-scale social and historical dislocations. such as Alexander the Great's India campaign and the Mongol invasion. Such periods of communication between East and West, which frequently took place at moments of historical transition and set in motion processes of dramatic social dislocation, were for Veselovsky the ideal conditions for the migration and diffusion of narrative forms. In his unfinished magnum opus, Historical Poetics, which was reconstructed by scholars after his death from the lectures he gave at Moscow University in the 1890s, Veselovsky goes further, creating a grand theory of the evolution of world literature. And his work has taken on a new relevance in the last few years in the English-speaking world since the rise of the study of world literature, following in the footsteps of world systems theory and the study of world history. And I'm sure that some of you know, for instance, Franco Moretti's work and also Pascal Casanova's, and then some of the sort of next, the responses to that work. And in fact, one of the new projects of the Historical Poetics Working Group is looking at historical poetics within the context of some contemporary theory. So how might some of the concepts of historical poetics be repurposed sort of in the contemporary context? From the introduction to Historical Poetics, Questions and Answers from 1894, Veselovsky writes, quote, "Literary history is the history of social thought in its imagistic poetic survival and in the forms that express this sedimentation." Now, what does this mean? Surprisingly, for his own historical moment, Veselovsky radically circumscribes the role of individual authorial creativity and instead sees literary works as the formal expressions of great social and cultural flows, responding to the social and psychological needs of peoples as they transform and develop over deep time. In this regard, Veselovsky doesn't significantly differentiate between literature and folklore, despite the crucial role of individual creativity and the self-consciousness of the creator in the former, although the increasing significance of the creative act and of the act of individuation will reveal the more sophisticated evolution of literature as compared to folklore. Literature, he writes, quote, "responds to the urgent call of the times. Just as motifs in folklore develop in response to deep-seated human needs, so do tropes in literary works," he argues, and such needs are defined within deep time rather than within the limits of the lifetime of an author or even of a literary generation. Literary history, for Veselovsky, is a special branch of intellectual history, but one in which the material consists of literary devices, plots and motifs. He advocates for the writing of a new literary history, one which would trace poetic formulas, images and plots across the boundaries of time, language, culture, to find the common threads which unite them, threads which resist the centralizing conformist tendencies of national literary narratives. And this was, I'll talk a little bit later on about the controversy of this position within the early Soviet context after Veselovsky's death. The lines of inquiry, the kinds of lines of inquiry Veselovsky suggests for further consideration in his Introduction to Historical Poetics, Questions and Answers, include reasons why the Slavic East never produced its own individual poetry, and hence a literary tradition in the Middle Ages, unlike Western Europe. Also the conditions for the appearance of large national epics, whether in unlike Western Europe, the conditions for the flourishing of drama, like in ancient Greece, Elizabethan England, and Golden Age Spain. He compares these three examples. The conditions for the appearance of large national epics, whether in the Greece of Homer, the Frankish state of Charlemagne, or the Germanic lands, which gave birth to the Nibelungenlied, but decidedly not in the Slavic East. And I can talk a little bit more about some of these examples in the question period. But as far as epic goes, he suggests that the conditions for the appearance of large national epics are the following. Individual poetic acts are possible, but the consciousness of individual creativity doesn't yet exist. national political self-consciousness has begun to develop, and there's a continuity with a prior tradition of sung legend with character types that can be transformed in accordance with new social needs. So for Veselovsky, this kind of balance of previous models of a kind of genre memory, as well as to respond to these new social needs, is very important. I'll talk about that a bit later on. The repeating patterns of motifs which recur within works separated by 1,000 years reveal, argues Veselovsky, underlying regulating laws of literary evolution. The renewal of plots is one of the most significant aspects of Veselovsky's theory, as is the idea of hybridity, that new literary models are continually being formed by the interpenetration of old domestic vernacular literary and cultural models by alien linguistic, cultural, religious and aesthetic influences. And it's interesting to one of the things I've been doing recently is thinking about some of Veselovsky's ideas of hybridity in the context of the theories of creolization and so on in the Caribbean. There's some, although the contexts are so very, very different, there's some similarities in various conceptualizations of sedimentation and hybridity. One of the great examples of this interpenetration for Veselovsky is the great productive cultural clash in medieval Europe between the new alien cultural and literary models brought by the church and the older folk and vernacular models which gave rise to the entire history of modern European literature. I go into all this just to show the incredible ambition of historical poetics and its goals. Now, Veselovsky knew very, very many languages, so modern and ancient. He was able to read Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, medieval Greek, and so on, as well as I think 15 or 16 modern languages. The connections of historical poetics with my own previous work concern my interest in the history and theory of the novel and in the idea of establishing the conditions for the flourishing of the realist novel. So sort of having come to this from a specific context, I became interested in Veselovsky as a theorist. Historical poetics seems to me to offer the possibility of combining my own interest in the life of a society and of a people with a very specific and detailed exploration of the formal features of a genre, going against the prevailing trends in literary scholarship, which are moving further and further away from close readings of form and towards larger cultural and historical generalizations, thinking particularly of the kind of distant reading that Franco Moretti's and his school does. Historical poetics seems to allow for the possibility of thinking about deep structures of history and society while always being guided by the imperative of literary form, of combining analysis on the macro historical level with analysis on the micro formal level. To me, it combines some of the best of Marxist and formalist criticism while having entirely different goals. And in this paper today, I won't be talking much about the contemporary usefulness of historical poetics, but we can discuss that afterwards. But I would certainly be happy to discuss that. Now, though, I'll move on to talk about Veselovsky's ideas about the novel and its history and their unexpected similarities with some of Bakhtin's work on the novel. Mikhail Bakhtin's 1940 doctoral thesis on Rabelais includes the following lines, edited out of the version later published in 1965. Alexander Veselovsky said that the epic emerges on the borderline of two tribes. It can be said about the novel of modern times that it emerged on the borderline of two languages. This is one of the few moments when Bakhtin hints at his enormous debt to his predecessor, the great comparatist Alexander Veselovsky. This observation highlights the common interests of Bakhtin and Veselovsky, their shared concern with the evolution and transformation of genres in the Longue-Durée, and the circumstances which lead to that evolution, the repeated transgression of borders, whether linguistic, cultural, or generic, and the confrontation, embrace, and assimilation of difference that results from that transgression. In the 1880s, Veselovsky turned his attention to the novel with a volume of studies entitled From the History of the Novel and the Tale, more than 1,200-page account of the development of the genre from late antiquity through the Middle Ages to the early modern era. That's the culmination of detailed philological research undertaken through the previous 15 years of research. The introduction is an essay entitled A History or Theory of the Novel that engages with older works of novel theory, such as Huet's 1670 treatise on the origin of novels, and late 19th century novel theorists such as Friedrich Spielhagen, but concludes that the theory of the novel cannot yet be written because so much of the genre's history remains unexplored. This work didn't receive the same attention by the Russian formalists as Veselovsky's unfinished Historical Poetics, and it might have languished in obscurity had it not been discovered in the 1930s by Viktor Zhirmunsky, one of the older generations of formalists. The introduction, an essay entitled A History or Theory of the Novel, was republished by Zhirmunsky in a 1938 edition. And that's this one here, which we have from the library. Take a look. And this was an edition which was of Veselovsky's selected works that was timed to mark the centenary of his birth. And it in fact led to an official backlash against Veselovsky in 1947, an official campaign of denunciation against the so-called kowtowing to the West, initiated by Stalin himself and led by the Union of Writers. And what was particularly threatening about Veselovsky's approach was its comparative nature, right? So the comparative method in the context of this particular period of the Soviet Union was said to lead, quote, to conceptions of the development of Russian literature that are monstrous in their self-debasement, contemptuous towards the people, and absolutely groundless, right? So this is obviously the Soviet Union of 1938, where the study of Russian literature must remain within boundaries, right? It cannot be placed into a context into a world literary context. There were a few scholars, such as Igor Shaitanov and Galin Tikhanov, who some of you may know of, have given cursory examination to Veselovsky's influence on Bakhtin's theory of the novel, as espoused in his 4 essays on the novel from the 1930s. That's Discourse in the novel from 1934 to 5, Forms of Time and of the Chronotope in the novel from 37 to 38, from the prehistory of novelistic discourse from 1940, and Epic and Novel from 1941. The close parallels that exist between Bakhtin's account of the development of the novel and that of Veselovsky has remained largely unexamined. And it's worth pointing out, though, that Forms of Time and Chronotope in the novel, in fact, bears the subtitle Notes towards a Historical Poetics, so it specifically refers to Veselovsky. And like Bakhtin, Veselovsky gives an account of the origins of the novel, its relation to the classical genre system, especially epic, and its evolution up to the 19th century. Veselovsky, though, is mentioned by name only once in Bakhtin's novel essays in Discourse in the novel, in relation to its ideas on language and myth. Yet there are many curious correspondences between the ideas laid out from the history of the novel and the tale, especially in the introduction, and the parallel approaches taken by Bakhtin in his 4 essays on the novel. Now, those of you who studied Bakhtin will know that, in fact, Bakhtin is well known for not citing his sources. So this is, in fact, not very surprising that he would be disguising Veselovsky's influence. Now, my study on Veselovsky's influence on Bakhtin is at an embryonic stage. But here I'll consider a few points of intersection from the history and discourse in the novel and epic and novel the two thinkers' accounts of the novel's origins, their differing ideas of its continuity and rupture, and their similarly bifurcating accounts of the novel's subsequent development. Both Bakhtin and Veselovsky examine the evolution of the novel over the Longue-Durée, in particular its relationship to the great prose forms of the ancient literary tradition, epic and drama. In A History or Theory of the Novel, Veselovsky gives a condensed but wide-ranging account of the novel's history that begins with an early incarnation of the origin story that really underlies historical poetics itself, which is the idea that artistic and poetic genres emerged out of a primitive syncretism based on ritualism. This is probably an aspect of historical poetics which is less relevant to the contemporary context, right? It very much bears marks of its origins in comparative mythology. At the roots of all verbal art, according to Veselovsky, are Dionysian-like ceremonies involving aspects of all the genres that would later become epic, lyric and drama. In these ceremonies, he suggests, poetry was sung to mime, bodily motions accompanied the singing, epic and lyric were inseparable from music and drama. The autonomous development of different aspects of the ceremonies eventually gave rise to their differentiation. An emerging conflict within the personality gave rise to the development of drama, a deepening subjectivity to lyric, and a need for collective bonding in the face of the encroachment of the other to the form of the epic. So these social needs are very much part of the development of these great generic forms. Veselovsky sees the novel's birth as arising out of a shift from the communal to individual artistic creation. Homeric epic marks the beginning of the transition from the communal songs and ceremonies of a people to the individual impetus behind the creation of a work. Homeric epic and the medieval epic chanson de geste reflect a moment when the individual poetic act is possible, but is not yet perceived as such. There's no gap between the poet and the crowd. Lyric is an important part of the transition from the communal to the individual. The ceremonial singer becomes the poet-creator, and at the same time makes his subject the analysis of his own I, individual passions and joys, disillusionment. Veselovsky notes that lyric plays a particularly important role in the medieval period and in the inward shift of chivalric romance. Tragedy's preoccupation with the divided self is reflective of the psychological toll of underlying historical processes. In this sense, for Veselovsky, lyric poetry and drama are the predecessors of the Greek novel, not in terms of their structure, but in terms of the psychological reality underlying their generic vision. And like the novel, they're the product of the disintegration of the epic vision into the personal. This is kind of a key transitional phase for Veselovsky. For Veselovsky, the impetus behind the transition from epic and drama to the novel is not only the shift from collective to individual authorship, but also a parallel shift in the focus of representation from the external to the internal world. Long-term historical factors underlie this evolution. It can already be seen in the first Greek novels. From an introduction to historical poetics, he writes, quote, "In Greece, drama is still in the zone of national historical development. The novel belongs in a time when Alexander the Great's conquests disturbed this development, when an autonomous Greece had dissolved into a worldwide monarchy mixing East and West. The tradition of political freedom darkened, together with the ideal of a citizen, and the individual, having felt lonely in the vast space of cosmopolitanism, went back into himself, taking an interest in the matters of the inner life in the absence of social ones, building up utopias for the lack of legends." And this, from the introduction to historical poetics, is translated and included in that volume which I sent around. After Christianity brought a different belief system, argues Veselovsky, the old plots were reworked and new elements added. He explores how recurring motifs from the Greek novel, such as meetings with family members or lovers after a long separation, achieve new kinds of moral and ethical motivations and imperatives after Christianity, now embodying or revealing new ethical ideals such as the rewarding of chastity or a new universe in which the one God is always in control. And this is where I would refer back to what I was talking about, the way in which almost a kind of repository of formal features exist for authors to kind of respond to, for authors to turn to in response to new social needs. So some of the same tropes which exist in the Greek novel, according to Veselovsky, are reworked within the Byzantine novel, but in a very new context. So they have a new meaning in this new historical moment. For Veselovsky, the 12th century Byzantine novel reflected the process of individuation and the separation of the personality. This process of individuation is crucial for Veselovsky. He traces the genesis of courtly romance to the rise of individuation. Yes, he insists that the fragments of the epic worldview and its preoccupations remained embedded in the genre, and there was a parallel development of the novel's outer concerns along with its inner ones. As Galin Tikhanov puts it in Veselovsky's vision, quote, "The novel is already endowed with protean features. It can stimulate the exploration of the world while making people more sensitive to their own selves." So this external and internal development takes place at the same time. The spectre of Veselovsky first appears in Bakhtin's works in the context of his conjectures on the origins of the epic. In Epic and Novel, Bakhtin refuses to speculate about the prehistory of the epic. Indeed, he is explicitly dismissive of Veselovsky's vision. On the topic of reconstructing the past of the epic, he writes, without mentioning his predecessor by name, quote, "Those hypothetical primordial songs that preceded both the epic and the creation of a generic epic tradition, songs about contemporaries that directly echoed events which had just occurred, such songs we do not know, though we must presume they existed. We can only guess at the nature of those original Edonic songs or of the cantilinas." Bakhtin, of course, begins instead with epic, which, as we know, for him serves as the novel's distancing other, with its impermeable, value-laden distant past, its reliance on national tradition, and the distance separating it from reality. The epic stands in absolute opposition to the novel, with its grounding in heteroglot contemporary reality, the new temporal coordinates of the image, and its appeal to experience and knowledge. Unlike in Veselovsky's scheme, the epic and novel are not subsequent genres. Bakhtin finds the novel's roots in Socratic dialogues and Menippean satire rather than in the epic. Indeed, he's remarkably circumspect when it comes to the question of the origins of the novel, though he does identify the Hellenistic era as a moment when, quote, "a closer contact with the heroes of the Trojan epic cycle began to be felt. Epic is already being transformed into novel. Epic material is transposed into novelistic material, into precisely that zone of contact that passes through the intermediate stages of familiarization and laughter," unquote. Overall, though, Bakhtin doesn't seek to create an origin story for the novel, like Veselovsky does, and of course like Lukács will do. Instead, as he puts it in Epic and Novel, he is, quote, "trying to grope my way towards the basic structural characteristics that might determine the direction of its peculiar capacity for change and of its influence and effect on the rest of literature." Bakhtin argues that the novel flowers during periods of historical rupture, the period of the breakup of the Roman Empire, the late medieval period, the late Renaissance, and the discovery of the New World. During such periods, he writes in Epic and Novel, quote, "The world becomes polyglot, once and for all and irreversibly. The period of national languages coexisting but closed and deaf to each other comes to an end. In an actively polyglot world, completely new relationships are formed between language and its object. In contrast to other major genres, the novel emerged and matured precisely when intense activization of external and internal polyglossia was at the peak of its activity. This is its native element, unquote. In Discourse, in the novel, Bakhtin examines the different ways in which the novel responds to this polyglossia, either by representing the multiplicity of languages and language relations within itself in the form of dialogized heteroglossia, or by assimilating them and insisting on its own monologic perspective, shored up against the world outside. It's precisely those works of dialogized heteroglossia, beginning with Apuleius's The Golden Ass and Petronius's Satyricon, and moving on to Rabelais' Gargantua and Pantagruel and Cervantes's Don Quixote, which can most fully be considered novels. Bakhtin's account of the novel's evolution is not one of continuity, but rather one in which the form becomes moribund for long periods of history, before being reanimated and transformed by new waves of polyglossia. For Bakhtin, of course, there are few novels to consider between Petronius and Rabelais. There's this sort of long period where nothing much is going on in the novel in this period. Veselovsky, like Bakhtin, rejects any account of the novel as a national genre, like the epic. He sees its evolution as the result of constant migrations of plot and trope, as a result of the large-scale movements of peoples, war and conflict, trade and exploration. His account of the novel's history emphasizes continuity as well as transformation. Unlike Bakhtin, he traces a continuous history of the novel from antiquity to the Renaissance without any crucial break. And in fact, his main examination of the novel's evolution focuses precisely on those periods that Bakhtin ignores, such as Byzantine Christian apocrypha of late antiquity, and the prose legends of the life of Alexander the Great, which circulated in Europe and the Middle East from the 3rd century on, known collectively as the Alexander Romance. So what Veselovsky considers novelistic material is very far from what almost anybody else might consider to be part of the history of the novel. From the history of the novel and the tale deals with the afterlife of the Greek and Roman novel in Byzantine literature, the recycling and transformation of motifs and plots as a response to the changing religious and historical circumstances. It examines the Christianization of the Greek novel in the 3rd or 4th century apocrypha entitled The Acts of Xantippe, Polyxena and Rebecca, which contains many of the plot elements of works such as Longus's Daphnis and Chloe and Heliodorus's Ethiopica. Veselovsky's examinations of the adventure plots in these works, in fact, seem to pave the way for Bakhtin's discussions of adventure time in forms of time and chronotope in the novel. Following this, Veselovsky continues with his earlier examination of the circulation of narrative plots over great expanses of time and space, focusing on stories in a 15th century manuscript collection known as the Alexandra of Sophia Codex, a South Slavic variant of the Alexander Romance, a narrative tradition dating back to the 3rd century legend, sometimes attributed to the Pseudo-Callisthenes. He examines the sources of a work known as the Serbian Alexander legend, within which appear such figures as Saint Jerome, as well as the Amazons, the Indian kingdom of the mythical Prester John, and other plots and motifs widespread in the literature of many different medieval European traditions. And one of the things that Veselovsky is interested in is how various kinds of Indian elements, various kinds of Asian elements kind of enter and mingle with the European tradition within these works, right? So this is, for him, is a wonderful example of the migrations of these narrative motifs. In the second volume of the work, he goes on to examine 16th century South Slavic versions of the legend of Troy, and then also 16th century Belarusian tales about Tristan. The studies of obscure works from geographically distant parts of the world from a period of over 1,300 years that make up from the history of the novel and the tale serve to illustrate the argument that Veselovsky makes in the introduction, which is that the novel cannot yet be theorized, right? Until a comprehensive history is written of the novel, we are not yet ready to theorize it without a detailed examination of its innumerable incarnations across huge swathes of time and space. In a sense, despite its inherent positivism, Veselovsky's challenge can be compared to Bakhtin's call for a new kind of study of the novel in epic and novel. Both argue for a radically new approach to this uniquely capacious genre. But whereas the approach that Veselovsky advocates is different in scale, the one that Bakhtin calls for is different in kind. In the conclusion to A History or Theory of the Novel, Veselovsky comes down heavily on the side of history, right? So it's the history of the novel that he's advocating before the theory of the novel, arguing that as encyclopedic a genre as the novel cannot yet be theorized since so many corners of its vast history remain unexamined. Bakhtin argues that the novel is still a living, still developing genre. It requires a completely different kind of analysis, one that takes into account the fundamentally new way in which it represents time and language. In their accounts of the novel's development from its first incarnation in the Greek and Roman novels of the 1st and 2nd centuries, Bakhtin and Veselovsky each identify two main currents in the tradition, currents which they follow through to the modern era. In History or Theory of the Novel, Veselovsky traces a line from the early Breton chivalric romances through the courtly literature of the 16th and 17th centuries, that is, the many versions of Amadis of Gaul, which is familiar, of course, to readers of Don Quixote, and the French 17th century Baroque pastoral novella up to the novels of Madeleine de Scudéry and Madame de Lafayette. This first group of works, he argues, have their roots in epic and maintain a connection to the totalizing epic past. The second current is that of the Italian novella, above all Boccaccio's Decameron, which follows from the Greek and Latin novels of the Hellenistic period and leads into the picaresque, the realist French novel of the 17th century, and Grimmelhausen's Simplicissimus. This second group, he argues, have broken their link with epic and find their source instead in medieval fables and legends. In Discourse in the Novel, Bakhtin too identifies two lines of stylistic development in the novel, beginning with the Greek novels of the Hellenistic period. Building on his claim that the novelistic form emerged out of the heteroglossia, a linguistic ferment of the fall of the Roman Empire, he argues that heteroglossia shaped the novel in two different ways. The works of what he calls the first stylistic line were shaped by the surrounding heteroglossia, but defined themselves by keeping the external competing languages and discourses at bay, assimilating them and incorporating them into their own dominant monologic discourse. Quote, "The presence of the multiple surrounding languages reinforced the unitary language and system of the novel itself. The literary language strengthened in response to the heteroglot world outside." Unquote. This is the tradition that emerged out of the sophistic novels and then coalesced in medieval chivalric romance, the Amadis works of the 16th century, as well as the 17th century pastoral novella and the Baroque novel. For Bakhtin, the chivalric romance lies on the boundary between epic and novel. But a work such as Eschenbach's Parzival is already an authentic novel. This line is turned on its head by the emergence of Rabelais and Cervantes, whose works belong to the second stylistic line. The works of this group embrace the polyglot world, incorporating heteroglossia into themselves without trying to mute the foreignness of its competing discourses, thus allowing for the dialogized heteroglossia that Bakhtin sees as the greatest distinguishing feature of the novel as a genre. This tradition, which closely resembles Veselovsky's second line, begins with Apuleius and Petronius, re-emerges at the end of the Middle Ages with the works of Villon and Rabelais, flourishes with Simplicissimus and the picaresque tradition, before developing into the heart of the modern novel with Cervantes. It shapes the great novel genres of the 19th century, from the novel of ordeal to the Bildungsroman. The 18th century sees the flowering of both stylistic lines, with Rousseau and Richardson representing the first and Sterne and Fielding the second, and at the beginning of the 19th century the two lines rejoin one another, most of the novels of that century representing a hybrid of the two. Though the defining principles behind the two sets of classifications differ significantly, the works which are subjected to these classifications tend to overlap considerably, though it's worth reflecting on the fact that the figure which for Bakhtin is the most transformative within the tradition, Rabelais, is barely mentioned by Veselovsky, and the figure which Veselovsky places at the centre of his account, Boccaccio, is virtually ignored by Bakhtin. Both set works which resist historical dislocation with their own idealized temporality, such as the chivalric romance, against those which allow themselves to be permeated by the present in all its dislocation, such as the picaresque. In conclusion, for both Veselovsky and Bakhtin, the novel is a genre which emerges out of and evolves according to the mixing of ethnic and national, cultural, artistic, narrative and linguistic traditions, which thrives during periods of rapid historical change, disturbance and transformation. Both see the novelistic form as reliant on and reflective of the mass migration of peoples and their languages and traditions, as dependent on centrifugal linguistic and cultural forces, and as resistant to the linguistic and cultural confines of a national tradition. Both are therefore attractive and instructive theorists in an age of transnational concerns and cosmopolitan preoccupations. While Veselovsky is interested in tracing the narrative material that passes from epic into novelistic spaces, in the transformation in that material as it migrates from Homeric epic through Greek and Byzantine romances and apocryphal legends, chivalric romance and the Italian novella through to the Western novels of the 17th and 18th centuries, Bakhtin is interested in the generic space itself, in what happens to language in the novel, the move from epic distance and epic past to the centrality of presentness and the new temporal coordinates of the novel. Veselovsky is interested in the migrations and renewal of plots and motifs from Homeric epic to oral folk tales, to Apuleius, to medieval tales, the new iterations of these plots and motifs, and the historical circumstances behind the recurrence of these plots. Bakhtin is interested in the ways in which the novel interrogates and reshapes language, how it raises the ideological and ethical stakes of linguistic mixing, diffusion, and transnational preoccupations. And I will finish there, and we can deal with various different issues in the question period.